I'm so happy to have Dipender with us. Every time I meet with Dipender, I can promise you I learn things and I reframe the way I'm thinking. And so my expectations, small pressure, is you're going to think differently when you leave this session. Dipender, if you can introduce yourself in terms of being an investor for so long, because I want the audience to really understand your vantage point.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. Always fun. So I just completed last month in September 38 years here in the Bay Area. I came here to go to graduate school and never left. And I started off in the semiconductor chip industry. That's what brought me here. I was an engineer, electrical engineer by training, and focused on the semiconductor side of it. So I actually came for the silicon in Silicon Valley. And that was sort of the golden age of silicon 38 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's ironical because nowadays everybody's talking about deep tech. The only kind of tech we had in Silicon Valley at that time was really deep tech because everybody was building something or the other. We were building chips, and then that led to building software which was very complex to help build chips. That led to large workstations that were sort of the power of the minis that DEC and Data General and others had built, packed into desktop form factors to build companies like Sun and Silicon Graphics and all those others. So all that was going on at that time. And then the semiconductor manufacturing industry started booming once the fabless model came about. And the fabless model was really what led to the explosion in electronics that we've all come to enjoy, which was the first time when the world said, instead of being a vertically integrated company like an IBM or one of the Japanese majors where you needed to own all aspects of product design from soup to nuts, including manufacturing, to be able to build a product, to this explosion that happened where you could have your own design software, so anybody with an idea could design any product, either a chip or a full product, ship that to a foundry, which was no longer captive in one of these companies, get your chip made, design the product, whether it was a set-top box or a phone or whatever, on another piece of software, ship that to an EMS company like a Flextronics or a Jabil or whatever your favorite one is, and ship your chips and get a product with your name on it without owning a single piece of manufacturing. That was really sort of the renaissance that led to the explosive growth in Silicon Valley in sort of those late 80s, early 90s, which led to, I think, a lot of fun that we've all had in that space. And so I was very lucky to be in the middle of that for the first 15 years. And then I got excited about what we could do with all this technology that we were building in Silicon Valley and how that could be applied to the large traditional industries, which were much larger than the electronics industry, but were quite devoid of the technology that we had come to know as technology over here in Silicon Valley, which was chips, electronics, software. So at that time, one of the analogies we would use was Caterpillar, which was such a global brand and a leader and just an amazing sort of heavy industry company, and marrying Caterpillar with a chip and software ethos and what you could get. And we used to use Caterpillar because it was such a visible, big product around the world. Little did we know that one of the big innovations that would come out of Silicon Valley would be marrying the car, also on four wheels, with those chips and batteries and software down the road, which became a lot of fun. So no surprise, the first idea that we had when we made the transition from building our products to investing was to build electric cars. And that was the most obvious big opportunity for all of us on this side of that fence. And we said the math and the science pointed to that it was time for cars to be electric, and it made sense from a thermodynamic point of view, from a power point of view, from a better, cheaper, faster, from an experience, safety, cost, all of the virtues that make a product great. And so that was our entry into investing. Yeah. And then we realized it was a bigger opportunity, and we never looked back.
Of course, Tesla.
Yes.
Which has been an amazing company to invest in. I'll give you a tidbit, actually, I don't think I've shared with you. When I was making the pitch to start TDK Ventures, I had one slide about imagine if we had invested in 5 years ago. And there was 5 examples. And it was end of 2018, okay, December 2018, I had Tesla in it. And the idea was, imagine if we had invested in Tesla, we would have understood the electrification of cars. At that time, it was $68 billion market cap. So, just to give a context. Now, this is the last day of 100X. Our first day was on digital transformation. And all day, despite talking about digital transformation, energy kept coming back. Every conversation was somehow about the electrons. And today is about electrification, the energy transformation, what we call EX. And I want you to talk about this clean tech 1.0 and the myth that it was a failure. And then we will talk about what does it mean for today.
So I think you're right. The general narrative that came out of Clean Tech 1.0 that it was a failure. And when I look back, I don't think at any level it was more of a failure than any other sort of pioneering technology. I think if you were to do a list of companies that were founded at any given time by sector, you would find the same amount of destruction and creation that happened in most technologies. I think the Clean Tech 1.0 failures were more publicized because of the politics around clean tech at that time. Because somehow clean tech, the energy transition, turned more into a culture war as much as a technology war and as much as an investment thesis. There was kind of an interesting dynamic where there became a little bit of the good versus evil, that somehow like you needed to do this because this was the right thing to do, this was the just thing to do, as opposed to this is just a better product. So I think both sides on that debate contributed to fueling sort of this good versus bad thing as well, which increased the stakes. So I think a lot of us who may have been here when any other revolution happened, like let's go back to, or we read about it, when the computers were built. I don't think like people came and said, guys, they're coming for your abacuses. This is like the end of our freedom. First they'll come for your abacus, and then who knows what they'll come for. So computers are evil, right? This is a bad thing. And then everybody gets riled up and they talk about every computer failure and they go, look, I told you so, this is going to be a disaster, right? When the Amazon AWS thing happened day before yesterday, we saw articles that said, these sites were down, it was a big disaster, etc. You didn't hear this huge political uprising that said, we need to pass laws that cloud computing is a bad thing, or that we need to get out of cloud computing in its entirety, or computers are bad and they're going to be insecure. And you didn't have like politicians doing interviews and presidents getting up and saying, this is a big con. You guys are screwed if you're getting into cloud computing. It was a big disruption, but you move on and you say this was a product failure or a bug or whatever. So back to your Clean Tech 1.0 thing, I think there were as many successes as you would have in an early stage environment. The volumes were actually very small. The numbers, I mean, I asked people to remember which were the worst, and the one that everybody remembers is Solyndra. Again, because it was on TV so much, because you had politicians tossing snowballs and you had people on every side yelling and screaming. Solyndra, I remember seeing it. We said no to it 3 times, but we weren't like, oh my God, this is a complete con. It was like many other ideas that we've heard, it worked, but the judgment on will it win the long arc of what it takes to make it better, cheaper, faster, we'd stepped back and said, it's a little complicated. It's very clever. I'd love for it. I'd love for it to be a teaching tool. I'd love for it to have in a clean tech museum or an energy museum or whatever. It was a beautiful product, very clever idea, but just wasn't going to make it to replace what it needed to replace. So we didn't invest in it because we said it's not a bad investment. But there was nothing immoral about it. It was a bunch of good scientists building it. It turned out that it had a bunch of politicians behind it who then used their influence to get that company some money, and so therein lay sort of this emotion around it, because when it failed, then it became a us versus them kind of thing. So I think Clean Tech 1.0 net was not anything worse than any other 1.0, whether it's SaaS 1.0 or Internet. Well, definitely it was nothing compared to Internet 1.0. We all know that. But remember, after Internet 1.0, it came back bigger, stronger, faster, with more investing, and all the big companies that we all enjoy now, almost all of them were born after Internet 1.0, even though Internet 1.0 was a big risk for a lot of people.
Actually, we talked about this, the fiber and the triple play. I want maybe you explain a little bit about this, because then we will move on to the electrification and generative AI. But I think this is a really good lessons from the past.
So the conversation he's talking about, we were having a conversation on like, what are some analogies out there of what we're seeing right now? And, one of the things that I think we've all seen in our world is when an idea becomes big and the opportunity looks big and the TAM is big and the SAM is big, a lot of people, rightly so, jump in to try and serve that market because it's a big opportunity. And that leads to a lot of people trying to compete, which is great. It's sort of an open market. People with better ideas feel like they have a better product, so they will get bigger market share. You've seen this in every industry. And the one industry that we got talking about was like the fiber optic, cable, communications, datacom rush that happened towards the end of the 90s. This was just before the internet bubble, the first Internet 1.0 bubble, grew and then burst. And at that time, I still remember conversations around the dinner table around how companies dreamt of this triple play. At that time, you could have voice, you could have data, and maybe you could start thinking about video. But this idea of putting all three on one was like, oh my God, how are we ever going to get to that? And that was only 27 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And then came the fiber optic promise to say, we'll pull fiber and you'll be able to do this triple play where you'll be able to put data, voice, and video. And that was like unbelievably amazing and a dream. And I still remember the first time you got that capability, you were like, oh my God, life will never be the same again. And a huge amount of capacity got built. And like everything else, got overbuilt. And then there was a crash, and several companies went out of business. But that industry didn't go out of business. It was very painful for a lot of people who had invested in that. It created a lot of capacity, and all of a sudden, the price of voice went to almost zero. The price of data plummeted like crazy, and video became possible and started becoming prolific. And then there was no stopping it, and you saw this whole idea of, the word streaming was not invented in this form at that time. The whole thing that made streaming possible was the low cost of being able to transmit that. So that was the example we were using, that if you were on the other side of that, you were basically saying this whole fiber optic overbuild is going to be a disaster because we only need so much for voice and we only need so much for data, and video is not happening anyway. Not knowing that on the other side of it, we will see so much innovation, which now says, I have the fiber and I have the bandwidth, what can I build with it? And along will come a whole bunch of new ideas, which will create entirely new industries and new business models, which will then make the original voice and data businesses look like peanuts. And that has repeated itself over and over and over again. And I think the reason why Nicolas is teeing it up is because we see an analogy in our world that you guys all are participating in.
Exactly, because when we talk about generative AI, and we talked a lot about today about the grid is not ready, we need to build more. We don't know if we are building overcapacity or not. I think your assumption is at some point it will be, but even if it will be, history repeating itself, it will still be net positive at the end.
I completely agree with that thesis. So obviously we're all building like crazy right now because we are way behind on current plans. So the planned starts, if you may, of data center capacity to feed all the needs are way higher than the starts in energy generation. And the reason for that is very simple. For those of you who are students of electricity and demand and all that, and remember the IEA charts, the International Energy Agency charts, for the longest time, till a few years ago, because I remember even the 2018 charts, showed for the last many years a decreasing demand for electricity in North America and Europe, basically the West. And only the continents of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, some parts of Latin America had net and electricity growth because their per capita usage of electricity was way lower. In fact, I remember maybe 10 years ago, the per capita energy usage in India was like 1/30th that of the US. The per capita usage of cars was something similar. Large numbers, I may be mixing them up. One was like 1/30th, one was like 1/12th. And we all knew that India, China at that time was not as far along as it is today. We're all going to catch up because that's what human progress was about. And so all of this energy demand and electricity demand was going to happen there, which is completely still valid. It is true. It is playing out. That ended up being a correct projection and continues to be the correct projection in the future. The part about electricity usage going down in the West was not a correct projection. And so when this thing turned with all this that has happened over the last few years, it caught all of those in the electricity business a bit flat-footed because nobody had planned that. Nobody had imagined that there would be that kind of demand in the US and Europe. And I don't think I'm telling any of you things you don't already know. And so now there's that gold rush, to your point, to build that capacity. And that capacity is still lagging the demand. At some point, you would expect that capacity to exceed the demand. And then there will be a few corrections. There will probably be some pain because when overcapacity happens, if things slow down, then prices drop and a bunch of business cases are rendered useless. But I think this time around, the product, which is electricity and energy, is less of a gamble because it's not like fiber. At that time, people didn't know what you do with fiber and what you do with fiber capacity because nobody had ever used fiber capacity prior to that. So people couldn't visualize, oh, if I have a bunch of fiber capacity, this is what I'll do. I think with energy and electricity, a lot of people have a lot of ideas of what they will be able to do. So as opposed to, oh my God, we're going to have this major glut and we won't know what to do with it, I think you'll start seeing a lot of other plans that people know are good ideas that will start coming online, and it'll enable a bunch of those. It'll also help as the price of electricity goes down to make a lot of business plans viable and to make them in the money. Like an exercise I always like to ask people to do is to say, if the price of electricity were free, what would you do with electricity? What would you change? And you can imagine there are a lot of things that people make in the world today that require energy, but they use a different form of energy. They would start switching over to electricity because it would be, in that case, if it's free. There are not too many other forms of energy that we can see going to a point where it's free. And if that electricity is low carbon or no carbon or whatever version of carbon you like, that will make it an even more beautiful thing because it'll put less stress on all the other forces that say energy production is bad because it pollutes our planet and it creates all these things. That's been one big hit against energy, just energy production. If energy is free and it's no carbon or very low carbon,
or negative carbon.
Or negative carbon. I'm hoping for that one soon. That's a beautiful thing, and that will generate. So I'm more hopeful of that collision and that excess capacity because I think it'll create a huge amount of additional innovation and create some very positive stories.
Yep.
As opposed to the uncertainty we had with the glut in fiber or some other uncertainties.
So I think the analogy of fiber and the example of fiber is important. The gold watch concept is important. Now I'm going to go somewhere where it's going to be very painful. Can you share about the positives you had for humanity on losing $100 million?
You had to remind me of that. So we've obviously been very lucky. We've had some great successes over the years and had a lot of fun doing it. He mentioned Tesla. That was our second investment 20 years ago. We've had a few in that ecosystem, and then we hope to have many more. One of the big areas in which we made multiple bets that we did very poorly on was solar PV technology. Not because it was a bad idea. Solar PV has turned out to be the most amazing idea in a long time. It was that we bet on a very innovative technology, multiple innovative technologies, which were all sort of close to best in class at that time. One of them would have remained best in class today had it been alive, even 10 years later. What we got wrong was the appetite for, or the lack of appetite for doing manufacturing in the US for solar for a long period of time. And so it was a timing issue and it was an appetite issue. And the companies that we invested in all did really well on what they needed to do, build the technology, made it viable, made it bankable, made it certifiable, all of that. And then they kind of said, okay, now I've done everything, now help me build a factory. And there was no demand for that because at that time, like even now, all of the manufacturing was happening in Asia, mainly China. And we continued to see that climb, but there was no equivalent appetite, not even from a fraction point of view in the US. And so in the end, we had to shelve the technology and put it on ice and shut it down and lost a lot of capital in those investments. But it was not because the technology was bad or the core thesis of solar will be an important piece of our mix. That was not wrong. It was just inability to raise the capital and to convince people that manufacturing here was good. Now, the reason why he was joking about the good is the reason we lost all that money was because of this amazing thing happening on the other side of the Pacific, which was this huge capacity of solar being built. And as painful as it for us as investors, and as painful as it was for us to lose our investment in that bet, what was coming out of the result of that massive build was a massive build of a very valuable form of electricity generation, which we're all enjoying nowadays, which was solar. And the result of all that production was that the prices were dropping like crazy. And here we are with incredibly cheap solar now available to most people around the world, and the ability to generate that electricity. But that had a big cost on all of us who innovated and built some of those technologies.
Now, before I move to my question on clean tech 2.0 versus 1.0, today it became very clear that infrastructure is sexy, maybe too sexy right now. But I want to touch on manufacturing, and how do you see the manufacturing component playing out here? Because we have a number of entrepreneurs Well, today making bet based on what will happen in terms of infrastructure and part of it on manufacturing.
So I think infrastructure is an easier thing to predict because there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be built.
Yep.
And there is enough demand for it, and there's financing for it, and there are business cases to support the build out of that infrastructure, of the consumption of that, of all of that. Manufacturing is a more complicated area. And that is, I think, a big deal because we've all stated the goal to say we need to bring and have more manufacturing in the US, whether you're from Western Europe or all these regions that have had a net loss of manufacturing jobs. So everybody's in agreement, generally speaking, that they want to do that. However, most corporations that make those decisions, that are for-profit corporations, that are working for shareholders, unfortunately do not make decisions based on wish and desire. They routinely have shown us over and over again, they make decisions based on where it's going to be the most cost effective for them. And so far, in general, whether it was the semiconductor industries, go back and look at everywhere that Intel built a fab over the last 30, 40 years, they built a fab where they got the best incentive. And nobody frowned at that because that was how fabs got built. Fabs were large capital projects, and they went where you could get the land, you could get the water, you could get the electricity, you could get the workforce, and you could get money because these were expensive fabs, and you wanted that money to be able to fund it. So I think the question of money is going to continue hampering manufacturing build out for a while, and I think we're all seeing it. There's a bit of a chill right now after that excitement over the last 2-3 years, where a bunch of battery factories got announced and commissioned, a bunch of EV factories got announced and commissioned, some solar factories got announced and commissioned. So those are all now sort of waiting to see what happens. And I'm not seeing too many new announcements or any new announcements. And I think the reason is people are waiting to see if they can get certainty of policy and whether some of these things will play out for the periods of time that they need to be able to justify a new factory. Round numbers typically for most of these factories tends to be 6 to 10 years, some longer, some shorter. But that kind of certainty is what most people will wait for before they turn it back on.
And that for me is one thing which really reframed my mind, because when we think about tariff, this is not a 10-year law. And so this is very hard to predict for businesses.
Yeah, I think when you talk to the policymakers, they will tell you that the purpose of the tariffs is to enable people to make decisions around manufacturing. And at one level, I think that is the case. It doesn't guarantee the lowest prices because with tariffs, you're using a protective measure that says I'm going to be protected on price because the competing product will be X% higher, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever percentage higher. And therefore, to compete, I need to be within that price range, which means I can afford to charge higher and then pay for my factory that way. You could do that. I think that's a way some economies did develop. But the problem is the longevity. So when you're underwriting a factory, people are looking for a certain number of years. So if, let's say, the tariff was in law, and it was a 10-year law that said these tariffs will last for 10 years, obviously that would create other side effects and huge global economic tensions. But that could work in that sense. If you're just looking as a purist, how to make a tariff work to enable a bunch of factories to be built, you would have to make it law and say, I kind of guarantee that this tariff will remain in place for 10 years. That is the duration that it takes for your factory to be viable.
And that was really thought-provoking for me. And so
I'm not sure if it has been done in other places. I mean, the part of the world I grew up in, when I was a teenager, that was the case. It was completely protected.
Yep.
And so you had, in 1980, cars that looked like they were built in the 1940s, because that was a technology that was protected and nobody else could come in. And so everybody was happy with those cars, and those cars were the same for 20, 30, 40 years, but it was a protected market, and so no other cars came in, and people built factories to build those cars, right?
Yep.
So you kind of get what you design for. And so some economies did come up that route, but they were not like rip-roaring successes or anything like that. They definitely didn't become global manufacturing powers.
So I feel like now we've got all the right building blocks to get to my last question, which is Clean Tech 2.0, which I would argue is now. What do you see as the same? What do you see as different? And why could we be hopeful about the new context, despite everything we see, geopolitics and politics and anything that's moving around? Why can we be hopeful about Clean Tech 2.0?
So I would say, what's the same, what's the different? I think what's the same is that most of what's driving the transition that succeeds has to be scientifically sound, thermodynamically sound, mathematically sound, which means Physics. I mean, you cannot defy physics. There's a good one, I think, that's been making the rounds lately. You've probably seen, there's this article that somebody published claiming to be Toyota that said Toyota has launched this car that runs on water. And it obviously made a big splash. There's even a photograph of it.
What a splash.
Executives, no pun intended. Then somebody very painfully goes into great detail to explain why it's real, and it talks about how this car takes the water, splits the hydrogen out of that, and then burns the hydrogen to propel the car. Scientifically, that's possible, but that doesn't make a lot of sense as a product, because why would you take a source of energy, put it on a car, to then split the hydrogen out and then run the car on hydrogen when you can use that electricity to run the car and be more efficient? So it's in the category of just because you can do it doesn't make it a good idea. I often joke, just because you can make pizza crust with cauliflower doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so
I think I understand that.
Yes. And so I think that remains the same. 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, I don't think that changes. That doesn't mean you won't see plans. It doesn't mean you'll see ambition that way. But I don't think those requirements have changed. And I can't think of anything in 1.0 that passed that, and in 2.0 that'll pass it, or 3.0, or vice versa. So I don't think that changes. So I think everybody who's in the space needs to always start with that and say, do I get to a better, cheaper, faster product than the incumbent I'm trying to replace, or that the market needs if there is no incumbent? Without that, there's not much point other than an academic exercise. And you have a lot of time in school to do those. What's different, in a nice way, I think, is when we started doing this 20 years ago, this was a very, very lonely space. There were a handful of investors. We would all meet over and over again in the same room.
A group therapy room?
Yes, and everybody was looking at all the deals. Like for the first 10 years, I don't think there was a single company that didn't come by us that got funded or didn't get funded, etc. Which was not something to be proud of. It was just the way things were. And that was largely driven by this virtuous cycle that happens in Silicon Valley, which is when you have successes, then the number of investors grows. When the number of investors grows, obviously capital grows. When capital grows, it attracts more entrepreneurs. When you attract more entrepreneurs, you get more ideas. Darwin works with a larger pool. You get better outcomes, and the circle just keeps becoming a bigger and bigger virtuous cycle. And I think that's what we're seeing. 20 years, that cycle has been going, and every year, that cycle has gotten better, where more successes, more investors, more capital, more entrepreneurs, more successes, more capital, more entrepreneurs, etc.
And repeat entrepreneurs and seasoned investors.
Repeat entrepreneurs who've done already more than one, teams, new tribes. We started Silicon Valley with the Fairchild Mafia, and then, you've heard of many mafias since. And now everybody's talking about the Tesla Mafia and, whatever your favorite clean tech company, the First Solar Mafia, whatever the successes are. Which is, again, a beautiful thing, because what that means is people have confidence and say, hey, these guys built $1 trillion company. They grew up in a culture that built $1 trillion company. At least we won't be confused about what we're trying to build and what success looks like, and what it takes, and where to hire from, and where to get advisors from, where to get your board members from, where to get other investors from, where to get lawyers from, who are the ones that make sense, who's come up with creative financing ideas. All of that you cannot underestimate the value of. So I would say we're now in a place where nobody can complain that it's lonely, nobody can complain there isn't enough capital, nobody can complain there aren't enough success stories, nobody can complain any of that, right? So we're starting to see continuously increasing number of entrepreneurs coming out and pitching, and that's a beautiful thing because, great ideas come from all different angles. So that's one. The second is, we find, this is kind of a funny one, where there's a lot of people that did very well in the internet economy, consumer internet, etc., who are kind of blessed with a lot of money because they were very successful, but they're kind of not very satisfied with the way they did or what they achieved. Because it's a little bit of the old joke of, that we were promised flying cars and jetpacks and all we got was 130 characters. Like, it's a bit like that. And so a lot of the people who kind of did very well with the 130 characters are now saying, I want to build my jetpack, or I want to build this flying car. And,
yes, that's true.
And that comes with a lot of advantages and a lot of credibility. So I would say that's the biggest difference, is that we're no longer in a scarcity and a shortage thing where there's only 5 companies to invest in and that's it, right? There's a lot of companies, lots of sectors. You already start seeing people defining which part of the sector you're in. And it all feeds on each other.
And just before we started, we were talking about, it feels like this moment of true human ingenuity, accelerating across every section. Part of it is generative AI, from energy generation, transportation, transformers, IVR, GPUs, cooling, LLMs, and everything else. And I was asking, can you think of any better analogy than the pyramids at the time? And I can't think of a better one.
Well, maybe the Renaissance. I mean, it is pretty amazing, right? That, and it's funny, I did an interview with Bloomberg a few years ago, just not too long ago, and this is before the whole generative AI and all that exploded. And I made the case there that I think this energy transition was the greatest economic opportunity of our lifetime, or definitely in history. And I think that remains true to being how big I was thinking it was going to be. Obviously, this AI opportunity is massive as well. And I think the generative AI opportunity, that what we've seen and come to know, I think is just the tip of the iceberg. The really big opportunity is physical AI, which comes right back into this ecosystem that we're all in the middle of, which is deep tech, physical tech, hard tech, system tech, right, from that point of view. And ironically, right now, if you think about the interconnection between the two, which is the biggest emergency in all of that is energy, and energy is going to be provided in abundance by all of what you guys are doing. And that connection is also going to be a very interesting virtuous cycle, because the massive market growth is going to provide for so much opportunity for all these different forms of energy ideas and new energy generation or transmission or storage, or even motors and power electronics and new materials. All of that is which is going to be needed to feed that, will create its own industries, which will then go become larger and spawn.
Dipender, I've decided to take on my closing remarks to have more time with you asking questions, because it's so good. So I'm going to take one more question, which is about physical AI. I want to double click. I nearly feel like generative AI is actually creating a real opportunity for, indeed, robotics. Even augmented reality, you could argue, has a bigger opportunity because of generative AI. What do you see as the biggest inflection point that generative AI is creating?
Again, I think generative AI on its own, I think, is creating some amazing opportunities. And the one that hits closest to us would be all of the advancements that we will see in materials development, in everything that it helps on the science side and engineering side. I think there is a parallel to generative AI on the physical AI side, which is how do you marry physical AI with what we enjoy in generative AI today, where you enable physical AI to be self-learning and predictable so that it can be as productive with machines and physical things as generative AI is with text today. And that, I think, is an amazing and big opportunity and something that you're going to start seeing a lot of.
That's perfect place to end. Dipender, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank
Always
you.
a pleasure.
Thank you. You liked it? All right. Thank you.